This is a video I've wanted to touch on for some time because I think it creates a number of interesting talking points. And it's about two issues that I feel very strongly about. One is human rights, the other is criminal justice. And basically, this is the pitch that I want to make as the overriding theme of this video, and that is I do not think it is a contradiction to believe in criminal justice, to believe in justice, to believe in punishment as being part of that equation, whilst also believing staunchly in human rights. So, what do we mean by this? I've always felt strongly about crime. I've always felt strongly that people who hurt society need to face consequences. And I have no time, I honestly have no time for the liberal left leaning argument of it's all someone else's fault, it's all society's fault, and that punishment is somehow punitive. I do not agree with that in any way, shape, or form. I think punishment for the sake of punishment is punitive, but I do not believe that punishment as part of criminal justice is punitive. And I absolutely don't believe that prison is revenge. I think that's a nonsense argument. Um, and I make no secret of the fact I get pretty angry when I hear people talking about, oh well, prisons just it's a university of crime, so let's just close all prisons, as if that would be either responsible or right. It wouldn't. We need penal reform, but the idea that violent people, arsonists, child killers, rapists, etc., avoid prison to me is grotesque. So I want to talk a little bit about how does this connect with human rights. Some people might say if you believe in human rights, you cannot believe in tough justice. I strongly disagree with that, and this is why. When it comes to justice, there are some basic principles regarding human rights. The right to due process. That is, if someone has been accused of a crime, they need their day in court. They need, in our system, we have a jury system. Some other European countries, it's a system where you go before a judge. I happen to believe the jury system is a pretty strong system that is used in Britain, the United States, I think most of Canada, and in many countries using the Westminster political system, use a jury system. I think it's a good system. I think it's transparent. I think it's open. I think it's a good system on the whole. I mean, that's not to say there hasn't been problems in the past, for example, with all white juries in the Jim Crow era of the United States. But leaving that aside, I think as a principle is a good thing. So having that sort of transparent process, and I'm not saying, by the way, without a jury, it can't be a fair process. In many parts of Europe that have pretty good records and regarding human rights, they don't have a jury system. So it doesn't necessarily follow that that being tried just before judges is a bad thing. But there has to be due process. So if you're accused of crime, all the evidence needs to be presented against you, and you need to have the ability to be able to be defended. Access to a lawyer is a basic human right, in my opinion. Being able to have someone represent you. And very often, where there's been miscarriages of justice, it's in part because the defendant didn't have a lawyer representing them, or a shoddy lawyer didn't give them the information they needed to know. So I believe that due process, including access to a lawyer, is fundamental. I think that when someone has been convicted, they need to have humane conditions. Now, what do we mean by this? I do not think that means necessarily the Nordic model, which is prisons that look like little more than hotel rooms with bars. In fact, I don't think they even have bars. I do not see that as being the ideal model. I think a prison could be humane without looking like something on the outside. I don't think it should look like something on the outside. I don't think a prison should look like a hotel room or a residential house. I think a prison should look like a prison. But humane means giving inmates access to exercise. It means giving them reasonable food. that's not gone off or anything like that. It means giving them medical treatment as well. If someone has a serious medical condition, I believe they need access to that. And of course, in America, there's a huge debate over access to healthcare in general. But I do think if an inmate has a serious medical problem, they should be treated. Um, I believe in compassionate visits. So if an inmate's mother is dying, letting them out for that day to be with their dying mother, things like that. I also believe there is a place, for example, for libraries in prison, for opportunities for inmates to take courses that could rebuild their lives. But it should not mean just giving them whatever they want. It should not mean luxuries that law abiding citizens on the outside don't always have either. So the way I look at it is a sort of balance. I do think there are problems in prisons, even in the Western world. I mean, I would consider solitary confinement basically psychological torture. When you get an inmate being holed up for 23 hours out of 24 a day, that's brutal. I do understand you get violent inmates that need to be isolated from other inmates or guards for their safety, but I think if you're going to put someone in solitary confinement, at least make it bearable. In the past, in the not so distant past, it was literally a dark hole. I mean, and even in modern prisons, you get like a translucent light that's on all the time. That's basically psychological torture. I mean, there's no other way to look at it. And I do think there is serious, serious reforms needed in the American penal system. But I don't look at the other extreme, which I regard as the Nordic penal system. I think something in the middle is the best option. I don't think prison's ever going to be ideal. It's never going to be perfect, but you have to have a situation that doesn't brutalize people, that greatly reduces, for example, bullying among inmates, among staff on inmates, inmates on staff. That's what I mean by humane conditions. This isn't easy, but it's necessary. Otherwise, you have a situation where people become like animals. Now, there's parts of the world where prisons really are like human chicken coops. You get, for example, Southeast Asia, parts of Latin America. You see these guys hold up, and these guys are not saints. Very often, they're gang members who've murdered people. But when you put people in basically human battery farms, that's going to be a recipe for disaster. Only this week, there was a bloody prison riot in Brazil, Para State. 57 inmates killed, 16 of them decapitated. I mean, that's absolutely barbaric. Now, the caveat to this argument is that in many developing countries, many law abiding citizens don't even have decent, humane conditions. So there would be a reasonable argument that, well, we need prisons, we need justice, and we cannot prioritize making prisons better living conditions whilst we're still working on getting law abiding citizens in better living conditions. So I do think some of us looking in from developed countries need to consider the context of that. But put it this way, I hope to God I am never, falsely accused of something, caught up in something and end up in a prison in, say, Cambodia or um, Vietnam or Thailand or somewhere like that. Because I've seen documentaries of, I've seen a glimpse of these things, and it looks like human battery farms. It really looks appalling. Um, but the point I would make is, of course, there's the obvious thing: the human rights of victims. They have a right for their human rights to be represented, and if they've been victims of crime, the right to justice, the right to get some level of closure, if not total closure, because I think that's impossible. If someone's had their relative murdered, no sentence will bring the relative back. That's obvious, but that's not what it's about. It's about proportionality. Um, so basically, I'm making a pitch to two groups of people. One is the super liberal side of things, which is like, oh, prison's punitive. Let's just let's ignore the fact they're violent people, or let's pretend that they have no responsibility for their own actions. The likes of the Green Party, if they had their way, they will never admit this, but if they had their way, prisons would close. That's incredibly reckless. But then there is the other extreme, which is the flog 'em and hang 'em brigade. And I've heard certain right-leaning people saying things like you get particularly notorious inmates like sex offenders and so on, particularly if it involves children, and they are often subject to beatings of other inmates. So the way I look at it is, yes, they're scumbags, but if you allow a situation where, for example, guards turn a blind eye to prison justice, then you have anarchy. You have criminals, convicted people, basically doing what they want on the inside. So I do not share this kind of glee that some people get from prison vigilantism, regardless of who the target is. I do think that, for example, child killers should never be released. And I would even propose a particular prison isolated from other people for them. But I do not, I don't see anything honourable about, for example, an armed robber killing a rapist. Okay, that doesn't make the armed robber a good person. It doesn't mean that he's suddenly vindicated himself from the armed robbery. Okay, so I don't share this kind of glee that some people get from prison vigilantism. I think that's an awful thing, especially if staff are turning a blind eye to it. One of the problems we have in Britain is a shortage of prison staff. I don't believe the problem is in overcrowding, actually. I believe, well, that is a problem, but I think the answer is to build no more prisons, not sentence fewer people. Because it seems to be a situation now where judges are sentencing fewer people, I think partly because of this reason, and that's a nonsense thing. To say, oh, well, you've raped this person, you've set this house on fire, you've assaulted a total stranger, but I'm not going to jail you because it would just add to the prison population. That that just gives that criminal, it just lets them off the hook. That is not justice. So I do believe we need serious reform of sentencing in this country. It needs to be far more empowering of the victims. But just to conclude, I do believe it's possible to believe in tough justice, to say you've committed a crime, you've hurt society, you're going to pay the price. But we're not going to brutalize you. We're not going to make it so difficult that you want to take your own life or anything like that. Um, it is tragic when a young person takes their life in prison. I take no pleasure from that. But there has to be justice, there has to be that system. And I do not believe it is a contradiction to say, I believe in human rights, I believe in inmates getting due process, access to a lawyer, medical treatment, and not tortured, psychological or physical. But also that if someone has hurt society, their victims have a right to see justice. And violent, dangerous people should be locked up. I believe some people can never be rehabilitated. And just to close, it's kind of connected with this. I watched Shawshank Redemption last night. If you haven't seen it, great movie. There we go. Great movie. It's about disclaimer. It's about an innocent man who spends time in a prison and all the philosophy that goes on in there. Very good movie. Tim Robbins, Morgan Freeman. Check it out if you haven't seen it. It is critically acclaimed and with good reason. Let me know your thoughts. I appreciate not everyone's going to agree. All I would say is if you go to either extreme, if you're of the flog 'em and hang 'em brigade, i.e., you think it should be a hellhole, that isn't going to help. Even if they deserve it, if you have someone that isn't on a life sentence and they come out, that isn't going to help. On the other hand, there is those neoliberal people who think that there should be no prisons. I think that is utterly delusional. Society has a right to be protected from violent people, and it isn't just a right, it's a responsibility of the authorities to ensure that happens. And it is simply the right thing. If I rape someone, if I set fire to a building and someone dies, if I assault a stranger, if I rob a pensioner of their life savings, this is hurting society, and I need to face consequences for that. So I do not believe there has to be a contradiction between a belief in human rights and a belief in justice. And I think sometimes, with the greatest respect of organisations like Amnesty International, sometimes when they lecture countries like the Philippines, I don't think they put enough emphasis on what we do believe in criminal justice. I don't actually think Amnesty International is neoliberal on these things. I think they do believe in justice, and they've often pushed for criminals to face justice. But they also need to make the caveat when they're criticising countries like the Philippines, and there's plenty of legitimate criticism to be made of Duterte. I think he's a very shady character, and I think his drug war has probably killed a lot of innocent people. But um, human rights groups also need to be careful to make it clear that they are not against justice. And sometimes they don't always make that clear, especially anti death penalty campaigners. Okay, they're making the argument about taking life, etc. But I think they need to put a strong caveat, but we do believe in justice. And they don't always do that, which then just buys into conservative hands. So let me know your thoughts. That's how I see it.